Every so often during Daf Yomi, I come across a Gemara that I'd actually learned before, as we'd say, on the outside. Meaning, I heard it, learned a teaching about it, but I hadn't actually seen it inside in the Gemara. And that's the case on Daf 109 of Pesachim. Actually has one of the most important Gemaras in terms of my own halachic journey, my own journey with Jewish law. And it's cool to see it for the first time. So if you read the Gemara, it seems incredibly, incredibly boring. You wouldn't see this and say, wow, this is something really significant for Dave's personal Jewish journey. So what is the Gemara? It's very simply that the measure of a mikvah is 1 amma, which is about this width, the length from your fingertips to your elbow, by 1 amma, by a height of 3 amma. That's how much a mikvah, a ritual bath, holds, which they say is about 40 seah, which is a whole measure of a different type of measure. So what's the significance of that? Who cares? It's talking about the size of a ritual bath. Why should that be so significant? It's not because of any ritual bath things that I went through. The significance is this. The significance is that these two measures, if we look at modern measurements, the two don't add up. So we know that in biblical times, in Talmudic times at least, that 3 cubic amot of water was the equivalent of 40 seah. Now we could take 40 seah and we could take it down to eggs bulks and how many eggs bulks the mikvah should be able to hold. But an amma is based on the size of the average human, and the eggs bulks is based on the size of the average chicken egg. So if we were to take an average chicken egg these days and an average human these days and try to create 2 volumes of the mikvah based upon these 2 measures, we'll find that they are not the same volume at all. In fact, the one based on the average human is going to be about twice the size as that based on the average chicken egg, which leads us to one of 2 conclusions. We can say that maybe people have gotten bigger over the last couple thousand years, or maybe chicken eggs have gotten smaller. Now, if we look into the world of archaeology, this is a very simple question. We can see that people have gotten a lot bigger. I first learned this from Rabbi Fink. I remember him pointing out that you go to the Tower of London and you see the suits of armor of the medieval knights who are the biggest, strongest people of their days. And they're short, they're pitsky compared to us. The biggest, strongest people are much smaller than I am now. And so we can see, okay, people have gotten bigger. You can look at ancient beds. You can look at all kinds of measures of households and things and see that we have gotten bigger. And we have archaeological evidence of the size of chicken eggs that they have remained more or less the same size. Though in very modern times, they've gotten bigger as we've, given them all kinds of hormones and we've raised them selectively for that. But up until this controversy had happened, they were more or less the same size. So it seems pretty obvious to say people have gotten bigger. Chicken eggs more or less stayed the same size. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Because the rabbis often didn't like looking at archaeology to find answers. And they said, you know what? We have this idea that generations are going downward. Therefore, we don't want to conclude that people have gotten bigger. That would sound like the generations are going upward. It sounds like an evolutionary argument, not a spiritual argument, which says that we had hit a spiritual peak back at Sinai and we've been going downward ever since. So this was somewhat problematic. Now, to me, it's not problematic to say that we've physically grown bigger, we've physically gone upward and spiritually gone downward, that if anything, the physical and the spiritual seem to be opposites of one another. But for some reason, they didn't go that direction. They said, okay, so we don't want to conclude that people have gotten larger. Therefore, it must be that eggs have gotten smaller. And if eggs have gotten smaller, all of these old measurements, which are matched up against each other, the egg's bulk is this much and it's worth this many olive bulk. So olives must have gotten smaller, eggs must have gotten smaller. All of these different things we measure from have gotten smaller over time, which is why when people go to eat an olive's bulk of food, like you do with the matzah on Passover, people wind up eating these gigantic pieces of matzah in order to fulfill their mitzvah of eating matzah on Passover, because they want to eat an olive's bulk and they think, okay, olives back in the day, based on this very Gemara we saw here, must have been gigantic. So this is one of those very unusual rules here that people wind up eating a ton of matzah. I had asked this question. When I learned this, it really bothered me. And I learned that there are some who say that an olive's bulk is actually the size of an olive, and many who say that it is not. And this really bothered me. So I turned to Rabbi Fink a year later, like literally this teaching was just bugging me. And I didn't say anything. And a year later, I came back and I said, remember last year you taught us that there's a small minority opinion that holds that an olive's bulk is actually the size of an olive. I said, well, if I want to hold with that minority opinion, can I? Is that an okay position to hold? Because it makes a lot more sense to me than this other one, based on all this logic that we'd heard about people staying the same size or getting smaller. And he said, Dave, you're asking me the wrong question. Don't ask me if you're allowed to hold by this minority opinion. Ask me if you have to, if what he said, you're chayav to. And he quoted Rav Moshe Feinstein, who said that if there are two opinions that in Jewish law that are both accepted opinions, and one makes sense to you and one does not, you are required to follow the one that makes sense to you. So since then, my family and I have stuck with this minority opinion that says an olive these days was an olive back then, and we only eat an olive's bulk of matzah. We had a small little bit of matzah, while the people around us are eating these gigantic pieces of matzah at Passover to fulfill their obligation. You have to eat in a certain amount of time. So people are literally, they're shoveling matzah in their mouths and they're trying to chew this dry, cardboardy type stuff at record speeds. And it's all kind of based on the controversy that comes from this Gemara that we see today on Daf 109 in Pesachim. For each person, I encourage them to look into the halacha themselves and find the position that they think makes the most sense for them and their own family.